In the pre-dawn darkness of October 25, 1944, Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague stood on the bridge of his flagship USS Fanshawe Bay, watching the grey waters of the Philippine Sea. Around him, 6 small escort carriers and 7 screening ships steamed in a loose formation 60 miles east of Samar Island. The carriers were launching routine anti-submarine patrols. The steel decks vibrated with the familiar hum of engines. The air smelled of salt and aviation fuel. He was the commander of Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3, providing air support for General Douglas MacArthur's invasion forces at Leyte Gulf. He did not know that in the next 2.5 hours, his tiny force would face the most powerful surface fleet the Imperial Japanese Navy could still muster. He did not know that the massive battleship Yamato, armed with 9 18-inch guns and displacing as much as his entire task unit combined, was steaming directly toward him at 30 knots. And he did not know that the decision he would make in the next few minutes, his most desperate decision, would turn his lightly armed ships into a suicide force and create one of the most stunning naval battles in history. Before the story continues, a note on our mission. This narrative is a 100% fact-checked account based on hours of research into primary historical sources, such as U.S. Navy action reports, declassified Imperial Japanese Navy records, Medal of Honor citations, Presidential Unit citation documentation, combat logs from USS Johnston, USS Hall, USS Heermann, and USS Samuel B. Roberts. Survivor testimonies compiled by the Naval History and Heritage Command, and official Battle of Leyte Gulf historical analyses. The images you are seeing are atmospheric. They are not a literal, moment-by-moment recreation of the narrative. Their sole purpose is to create a mood. Think of this as a historical audiobook with visual accompaniment. If you believe true stories are more powerful than fiction, please support our mission of telling them by liking and subscribing. Now, the story continues. At 06:37 hours on October 25, 1944, Ensign William C. Brooks was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol in his Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, launched from the escort carrier USS St. Lo. He was scanning the horizon northwest of Taffy 3, expecting nothing more dangerous than the morning's cloud formations. Then he saw the masts. Pagoda masts, the distinctive superstructures of Japanese battleships, cutting through the dawn haze. He banked his aircraft closer, disbelieving what his eyes were telling him. The ocean below was filled with warships. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. The entire Japanese center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, steaming directly toward Taffy 3 at combat speed. Brooks grabbed his radio and transmitted to Admiral Sprague. His voice crackled over the frequency with words that would define the morning. Enemy surface force, 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 20 miles northwest, closing at 30 knots. Sprague was incredulous. He assumed it was a case of mistaken identity, some confused aviator reporting Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet. But Brooks flew closer, close enough to read the rising sun battle flags snapping in the wind. His second transmission removed all doubt. "I can see pagoda masts," he reported. "I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw." The biggest battleship was Yamato. She displaced 72,000 tons, as much as all 13 ships of Taffy 3 combined. Her 9 Type 94 18-inch guns were the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship, each gun weighing as much as an entire destroyer. Each armor-piercing shell weighed over 3,000 pounds and could be fired to a range of 26 miles. Behind Yamato came her sister battleships, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, mounting 14-inch and 16-inch guns. The heavy cruisers Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, Chokai, Haguro, and Tone added their 8-inch batteries. It was the most powerful surface force Japan could still deploy. Taffy 3 was not designed to fight battleships. The task unit consisted of 6 Kaiser-class escort carriers, small ships built on merchant hulls with a top speed of 18 knots. They carried no armor. Their flight decks were thin steel. Each carrier embarked approximately 12 to 14 FM-2 Wildcat fighters and an equivalent number of TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, armed with fragmentation bombs and depth charges for ground support and anti-submarine warfare, not armor-piercing weapons for surface combat. The screening force was equally outmatched. 3 destroyers, USS Johnston, USS Howell, and USS Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, USS Raymond, and USS Samuel B. Roberts. None carried guns larger than 5 inches. The 5-inch shells, weighing 54 pounds, could not penetrate the armor of Japanese cruisers or battleships. Their maximum range was 7 miles. The Japanese could fire from distances where American guns were useless. The reason Taffy 3 was alone was strategic catastrophe. Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, with its fast carriers and modern battleships, had been lured north by a Japanese decoy force. Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid's 7th Fleet battleships were engaged to the south at Surigao Strait, annihilating a separate Japanese force. San Bernardino Strait, the northern gateway to Leyte Gulf, had been left unguarded. Kurita's center force had slipped through the strait at 0300 hours, undetected and unopposed. Now it was steaming directly toward the invasion beaches where MacArthur's 6th Army, over 130,000 men, were vulnerable. Between the Japanese fleet and the defenseless transports stood only Taffy 3. At 0658 hours, massive geysers of water erupted around the escort carriers. Yamato had opened fire with her main battery. The shells screamed overhead with sounds like freight trains. Each splash threw tons of seawater hundreds of feet into the air. The water columns were dyed with color: red, green, yellow, and purple. Chemical markers the Japanese used to spot their salvos. Admiral Sprague realized immediately that standard procedure, the textbook response, would result in the annihilation of his task unit within minutes. Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague, nicknamed Ziggy by the men who served under him, had not expected to face this kind of fight. He had graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1918, too late to see action in the First World War. His career had been built in aviation, not surface combat. He had commanded seaplane tenders and training carriers. He had been promoted to Rear Admiral only in April 1943. Task Unit 77.4.3 was his first major combat command. The escort carriers under his authority were not warships in the traditional sense. They were support vessels, floating air bases designed to provide air cover for amphibious operations, to hunt submarines, to ferry aircraft. They had been in position off Samar for 5 days, launching strikes against Japanese positions on Leyte, supporting the troops on the beaches. It was routine work, safe work, as long as the perimeter was held. But the perimeter was not held. San Bernardino Strait had been left open. Halsey had taken the Third Fleet north. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, slow and defenseless, were now the only barrier between Kurita's battleships and the invasion fleet. At 0700 hours, Admiral Sprague faced the impossible decision. Standard doctrine for escort carriers encountering enemy surface forces was simple. Run. Turn away from the enemy, make smoke, launch all available aircraft, and call for help. But running south would expose the escort carriers' vulnerable sterns to Japanese gunfire. The 18-knot carriers could not outrun 30-knot battleships. Within an hour, Yamato and her consorts would close the range and methodically destroy every ship in Taffy 3. Even if the carriers survived, running south would open a clear path for Kurita to reach Leyte Gulf and the invasion fleet. Sprague made his decision. At 0706 hours, he issued the order that defined the battle. He ordered his destroyers to attack. Not to screen, not to lay smoke and retreat. To attack. To charge directly at the Japanese battleships with torpedoes. It was a suicidal order. The 3 destroyers of Taffy 3, Fletcher-class ships displacing 2,400 tons, armed with 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes each, were being sent against battleships displacing 40 to 70,000 tons, armed with guns that could destroy a destroyer with a single hit from ranges where the destroyers could not fire back. It was David against Goliath, except David had no sling, only a knife, and Goliath had a cannon. At 0716 hours, Sprague repeated the order. Destroyers make torpedo attack. At 0742 hours, he extended the order to the destroyer escorts. Little wolves, he transmitted, using their radio call sign. Form up for a second attack. The destroyer escorts were even smaller than the destroyers, 1,200 tons, designed to hunt submarines, not fight cruisers. But they were being ordered to charge into the teeth of the Japanese fleet. This was Sprague's most desperate choice. He was ordering his screening ships to die. The torpedoes were the only weapons Taffy 3 possessed that could threaten a battleship, but launching them required the destroyers and destroyer escorts to close within 10,000 yards, 5 miles, of the Japanese guns. The 5-inch guns on American destroyers had an effective range of 7 miles. The 14-inch guns on Japanese battleships had an effective range of 23 miles. The 18-inch guns on Yamato could reach 26 miles. The destroyers would be under fire for 15 miles before they could even shoot back. They would be under fire for another 7 miles before they could launch torpedoes. The decision was a calculated sacrifice. Sprague was trading his destroyers for time. If the destroyers could force the Japanese battleships to maneuver, to evade torpedoes, to change course, they would slow the pursuit. If the destroyer attacks were aggressive enough, if they were reckless enough, they might confuse Kurita about the size of the American force. The carriers would gain minutes. Those minutes might be enough to reach the cover of a rain squall. Those minutes might be enough for the aircraft to rearm and strike back. This was the core of the decision. Sprague was betting that his men would not hesitate. He was betting they would charge into certain death to buy time for the carriers. Because if the destroyers failed, if they turned back, if the torpedo attacks were not pressed home with absolute ferocity, then Taffy 3 would be annihilated. Leyte Gulf would be exposed, and MacArthur's invasion force would be destroyed at anchor. This was his choice. Order 7 ships and their crews to die with the slim hope of saving 6 carriers. Or watch all 13 ships be destroyed within the hour, and the invasion fail. USS Johnston was the first to charge. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, a commanding officer, did not wait for the order to be repeated. Evans was a Native American, Cherokee and Creek, born in Oklahoma in 1908. He had commissioned Johnston exactly 1 year earlier, on October 27, 1943. During the commissioning ceremony, he had told his crew, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." He lived by those words. At 07:10 hours, Johnston broke formation and turned northwest, directly toward the Japanese fleet. She was alone. The other destroyers had not yet received the attack order. Evans ordered flank speed, 35 knots, every engine pushed to maximum. The engineering spaces became infernos of heat and noise. Johnston began laying a smokescreen from her stern, thick white chemical smoke that billowed across the water, obscuring the carriers behind her. She charged through the smoke toward the enemy, and at 18,000 yards, 9 miles, the Japanese opened fire. The first salvos bracketed Johnston with colored splashes. Red dye from one ship, green from another, yellow, purple. The Japanese were using the dye to identify which ship was scoring hits. Evans ordered evasive maneuvers, chasing the splashes. The tactic was based on the assumption that Japanese gunners would not fire twice at the same spot. Johnston zigzagged through the shell splashes, the deck heeling as she turned, the 5-inch gun mounts tracking the nearest Japanese ship. At 14,000 yards, 7 miles, Johnston opened fire. Her target was the heavy cruiser Kumano, leading the Japanese formation. Johnston's Mark 37 fire control radar gave her a decisive advantage in gunnery. The radar provided accurate firing solutions even at maximum range. Johnston fired over 200 rounds in 5 minutes, rapid fire, the 5-inch guns recoiling and loading and firing again. Hits were observed on Kumano's superstructure. Fires erupted on the cruiser. The Japanese returned fire with their 8-inch batteries, but Johnston was closing at flank speed, her silhouette changing constantly as she maneuvered. At 10,000 yards, 5 miles, Evans ordered the torpedo launch. Johnston fired all 10 Mark 15 torpedoes in a single spread, aimed at Kumano. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal, white wakes trailing across the water. At least one torpedo struck Kumano's bow. The explosion was massive. The cruiser's bow was blown off, severed forward of the first turret. Kumano slewed out of formation, dead in the water, out of the battle. A second cruiser, Suzuya, was detached to escort the crippled Kumano back to San Bernardino Strait. Evans had removed 2 heavy cruisers from the fight with a single torpedo spread. But Johnston's charge had drawn the attention of the Japanese battleships. At 07:24 hours, shells from battleship Congo hit Johnston. 3 14-inch shells smashed into the destroyer's hull. The first shell penetrated the engine room, destroying one engine and killing the engineering crew instantly. The second shell hit the bridge, shredding the superstructure with shrapnel. Evans was wounded, 2 fingers of his left hand blown off, his uniform shredded, his body peppered with metal fragments. The third shell destroyed the aftergun director. Johnston's speed dropped to 17 knots. Her steering was disabled. Communications with the afterpart of the ship were severed. Evans refused to leave the bridge. He wrapped his mangled hand in a rag and continued issuing orders. Johnston could not retreat. She had fired all her torpedoes. She had one functioning engine. But she could still fight. Evans ordered his remaining guns to continue firing. Johnston began engaging the Japanese destroyers, smaller ships she could damage with 5-inch shells. She fired at Japanese cruisers whenever they came into range. She continued making smoke, obscuring the carriers. For the next 2 hours, Johnston fought as a moving artillery platform, battered but defiant, drawing fire away from Taffy 3.
USS Hole and USS Heermann joined Johnston's charge at 0720 hours. Commander Leon S. Kintberger, commanding Hull, ordered his ship to attack battleship Congo at maximum speed. Hull closed to 18,000 yards under heavy fire, launched 5 torpedoes at Congo, then turned and launched her remaining 5 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Haguro. The Japanese battleships and cruisers maneuvered violently to avoid the torpedoes. The maneuvers broke up the Japanese formation. Ships scattered, losing coordination. Kurita's orderly pursuit dissolved into a melee. But Hull paid the price. Japanese shells hit her again and again. A 14-inch shell from Congo destroyed Hull's bridge, killing most of the command crew. Kintberger shifted his command to the stern. A shell hit the engine room. Hull's speed dropped. Another shell destroyed her forward gun mounts. Hull continued firing with her remaining guns, but she was dying. At 0830 hours, after sustaining more than 40 direct hits from battleship and cruiser fire, Hull rolled over and sank. Of her crew of 330, only 86 survived. USS Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos T. Hathaway, charged directly between the escort carriers and the Japanese cruiser Chikuma, firing at point-blank range. Heermann closed to within 4,000 yards of Chikuma, so close the Japanese could not depress their guns low enough to hit her. Heermann's 5-inch guns raked Chikuma's superstructure. The cruiser turned away, damaged and burning. Heermann then engaged heavy cruiser Tone, dueling shell for shell, until aircraft from Taffy 3 arrived and drove Tone out of the fight. Heermann survived the battle, but only because Commander Hathaway maneuvered so aggressively that Japanese gunners could not track her. At 0750 hours, Admiral Sprague ordered the destroyer escorts to attack. The Little Wolves, the smallest warships in Taffy 3, charged into the battle. USS Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, engaged heavy cruiser Chikuma. Roberts closed to within 5,000 yards and fired her 3 Mark 15 torpedoes. All 3 missed, but Roberts continued firing her 2 5-inch guns at maximum rate, over 600 rounds in the next hour, so many rounds that the gun barrels overheated and began to droop. Roberts scored multiple hits on Chikuma, setting the cruiser on fire. But at 0850 hours, shells from Japanese cruisers hit Roberts. The first shell destroyed her engine room. The second shell detonated the aft ammunition magazine. The explosion broke Roberts's keel. She sank at 0905 hours, taking 90 men down with her. USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, and USS Raymond also made torpedo runs, forcing the Japanese to maneuver, buying time for the carriers. The destroyers and destroyer escorts were being destroyed one by one, but their attacks were working. Kurita's formation was in chaos. His ships were scattered across miles of ocean, maneuvering independently to avoid torpedoes, firing at targets of opportunity. The coordinated attack Kurita had planned at 0700 hours had devolved into a confused brawl. The escort carriers were not passive targets. Every aircraft that could fly was launched. Fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, all armed with whatever ordnance was available. Most carried depth charges and fragmentation bombs, useless against battleship armor, but the pilots attacked anyway. They made strafing runs with machine guns. They dropped bombs on cruiser decks. Some pilots, out of ammunition, made dry runs, flying low over Japanese ships to force them to maneuver. Pilots from Taffy 2 and Taffy 1 joined the attack, rearming with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The air over the battle was filled with American aircraft, swarming the Japanese fleet like hornets. The carriers themselves were under fire. USS Gambit Bay, the northernmost carrier, was hit repeatedly by Japanese cruiser fire. Shells tore through her unarmored hull. Fires erupted on her hangar deck. At 0850 hours, Gambit Bay lost power. Dead in the water, she was pounded by cruiser Chikuma at close range. At 0907 hours, Gambit Bay capsized and sank. She was the only American aircraft carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war. But the other carriers survived. USS Fanshawe Bay, Sprague's flagship, was hit by 6 shells but remained afloat. USS White Plains, USS Kalinin Bay, USS Kitkun Bay, and USS St. Lo maneuvered through the shell splashes, their wakes zigzagging across the water. The rain squalls Sprague had steered toward provided temporary cover. The smokescreens laid by the destroyers obscured the carriers from Japanese gunners. The carriers stayed just out of range, just fast enough to stay ahead of the pursuit. At 0925 hours, Vice Admiral Kurita issued an unexpected order. His ships were to cease fire and regroup. The Japanese battleships and cruisers turned northwest, away from the carriers, away from Leyte Gulf. Kurita had lost 3 heavy cruisers, Kumano, Suzuya, and Chokai, the last sunk by air attack. His flagship Yamato had been forced to maneuver violently to avoid torpedoes, losing 30 minutes steaming in the wrong direction. Kurita's staff officers were reporting that they were facing fleet carriers and heavy cruisers, not escort carriers and destroyers. The ferocity of Taffy 3's defense had convinced Kurita he was fighting Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. He believed more American carriers were over the horizon. He ordered his scattered ships to regroup and reassess before resuming the attack. But Kurita never resumed the attack. For over 3 hours, he steamed in circles, changing course repeatedly, unable to decide whether to continue toward Leyte Gulf or retreat through San Bernardino Strait. At 1310 hours, he made his final decision. He ordered the center force to withdraw. The Japanese fleet turned north and steamed back through San Bernardino Strait. The invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf was saved. The ocean was littered with debris. Oil slicks spread across the water, black and shimmering. Life rafts floated among wreckage carrying wounded men. The survivors of USS Johnston, USS Hollow, USS Samuel B. Roberts, and USS Gambit Bay were in the water, clinging to wreckage, waiting for rescue. Commander Ernest Evans of Johnston was not among them. He had been last seen on Johnston's bridge as the ship went down. Some survivors reported seeing him in a lifeboat. Others believed he went down with the ship. He was never found. His body was never recovered. The rescue operations took days. Over 1,000 men were in the water. Many were wounded. The water was warm, but dehydration and exposure took their toll. Sharks were a constant threat. Some men died while waiting for rescue. The final tally would show that of Johnston's crew of 327, 141 survived. Of Hollow's 330, 86 survived. Of Samuel B. Roberts's crew of 224, 120 survived. Of Gambit Bay's crew of 860, approximately 800 survived.
but only because the carrier sank slowly enough for most of the crew to abandon ship. The statistics of the battle were staggering. Taffy 3 had lost 2 escort carriers, USS Gambier Bay and USS St. Lo. The latter sunk by a kamikaze attack after the surface battle ended. 2 destroyers, USS Johnston and USS Hollow, were sunk. 1 destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, was sunk. 23 aircraft were lost. The total casualties for Taffy 3 were 1,583 men killed and missing. It was comparable to the combined American losses at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. But Taffy 3 had stopped the Japanese center force. Vice Admiral Kurita had retreated with 4 battleships, including the undamaged Yamato, and numerous cruisers and destroyers still combat-capable. He had been within 20 miles of Leyte Gulf, within gun range of the defenseless transports and landing craft. A single sustained bombardment would have devastated MacArthur's invasion fleet. But Kurita had turned back. The ferocity of Taffy 3's resistance, the torpedo attacks by the destroyers, the relentless airstrikes, and the confusion of the melee had convinced him he was facing a superior force. He had withdrawn, believing he had avoided a trap. The Japanese losses were severe. 3 heavy cruisers, Kumano, Suzuya, and Chokai, were sunk or crippled beyond repair. Heavy cruiser Chikuma was fatally damaged and scuttled later that day. Numerous other ships were damaged by gunfire, torpedoes, and airstrikes. Over 2,700 Japanese sailors were casualties. The center force's withdrawal ended Japan's last offensive operation of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Admiral Sprague filed his action report with a single sentence that captured the impossible nature of what had happened. The failure of the enemy main body and encircling light forces to completely wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smokescreen, our torpedo counterattack, continuous harassment of enemy by bomb, torpedo, and strafing air attacks, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God. The men of Taffy 3 did not cheer when Kurita withdrew. They were exhausted. Many were wounded. They sat on the decks of the surviving carriers, staring at the empty horizon where the Japanese fleet had been. Some wept. Others simply closed their eyes. The escort carriers began recovering aircraft, the pilots landing with fuel tanks nearly empty, their planes riddled with bullet holes. The destroyers and destroyer escorts that survived began searching for survivors in the water. The battle had lasted 2.5 hours. In that time, 7 small ships and their crews had stopped the most powerful surface fleet Japan could deploy. The Presidential Unit Citation, awarded to Task Unit 77.4.3, described the action as one of extraordinary heroism. The citation stated that the gallant ships of the task unit waged battle fiercely against the superior speed and firepower of the advancing enemy, and that 2 of the unit's valiant destroyers and 1 destroyer escort charged the battleships point blank and went down under the enemy's heavy shells as a climax to 2.5 hours of sustained and furious combat. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the nation's highest decoration for valor. The citation noted that he launched the first torpedo attack when Johnston came under straddling Japanese shellfire, that he gallantly diverted the powerful blasts of hostile guns from the lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection, and that his valiant fighting spirit throughout this historic battle will venture as an inspiration to all who served with him. The Battle of Samar became required study at naval war colleges. It is cited as one of the greatest mismatches in naval history, and as proof that courage, aggression, and tactical audacity can overcome overwhelming material superiority. The destroyer escort USS Evans was commissioned in 1955, named in honor of Commander Evans. In 2023, the U.S. Navy announced that an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, DDG-141, would be named USS Ernest E. Evans. The wreck of USS Johnston was discovered in October 2019 by a privately funded expedition, resting on the ocean floor at a depth of over 20,000 feet, one of the deepest shipwrecks ever found. The wreck of USS Samuel B. Roberts was discovered in June 2022 at a depth of over 22,000 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever located. Both discoveries renewed interest in the battle and the men who fought it. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison wrote that in no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 0730 and 0930 off Samar. The battle is remembered as the moment when 7 small ships, outgunned and outnumbered, charged into certain death and saved an army. The story of the Battle of Samar is the story of men who understood the mission and accepted the cost. Commander Ernest Evans knew Johnston was outmatched when he charged Yamato. Commander Leon Kintberger knew Howell would not survive when he attacked Congo. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland knew Samuel B. Roberts was too small to fight cruisers. Admiral Clifton Sprague knew he was ordering his destroyers to die. They did it anyway. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite fear, to charge into the guns because the alternative is unthinkable. The men of Taffy 3 had every reason to retreat, to preserve their ships, to save their own lives. They chose to fight. They chose to buy time with their blood. They chose to stand between the enemy and the men on the beaches who depended on them. That choice, made in the space of seconds on a grey morning in October 1944, defined the battle and defined their legacy. The story of Taffy 3 is one of thousands of acts of heroism that shaped the outcome of the Second World War. These stories deserve to be told. These men deserve to be remembered. If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with the name of a leader or battle you want us to cover next. Thank you for watching, and remember, courage is a choice.